So we've got an energy, we've got an enthusiasm, we've got the economic side, we've got the military side. What we need to focus on now is really the ideological side, which is giving people a sense of what India is really trying to achieve in the world. And at every single level, people need to have a sense of what is India trying to achieve in the world. When the Americans were rising in the 1880s, they had this very racist, of course, notion, and that they were up there to uplift and Christianize the world, spread American values like democracy and free trade. So they combined a moral case with a practical case, and they went out to all Americans. And even today, you go to an American and you say, what does America stand for in the world? They're like, oh, we want to spread human rights, democracy, things like that. Regardless how they may have not lived up to their own standard, every American has some sense of this is what America stands for in the world. It used to be much stronger in the 50s and 60s before Vietnam, but that sense of this is what we are in the world. And I think that in India, we need to do a lot more work on that, which is really come up with a comprehensive ideology that goes to Indians and says, this is what we're about, this is what we stand for in the world. And if you are able to do that, then you will see a much stronger India, which combines economics, military, and ideology. That in a very comprehensive way says that this is what India stands for in the world, this is how our economics and our military combine, and this is how we're going to use it to combat national security threats, this and that. So I think that it gives ideology gives is underrated, and it gives like an overall cohesion to foreign policy, and it creates what we might call a grand strategy.
Very good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Bharat Varta. This is your host Sharan here. I'm joined by somebody really special. He covers foreign affairs for LiveMint, and he's also been a junior fellow at ORF, which is Observer Research Foundation. Let me introduce Shashank Mattoo to you. Shashank, welcome to the show. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Shashank, it's a very interesting job profile to have, and especially increasingly in the field of journalism, there's very few people who actually cover foreign affairs with a lot of integrity and honesty, and who can go in depth into what today's geopolitics is all about. I think you're one of the few young voices out there. So starting off with a not so serious question, how different is research from writing for journalism, in terms of its coverage and in terms of your scope of work? How different is that?
Right. I think number one, the speed is completely different. In research at the Observer Research Foundation, we were asked to write, for example, two pieces a month, 1,000 words. So you'd essentially be writing 2,000 words, and after that, anything you did, whether it was long form or for newspapers, was pretty much on your own time. In journalism, you pretty much write 1,000 words a day. So I think the speed is, of course, very intense. I think that most researchers tend to do this, but I think that journalism is a very on your feet sort of job. You're always running around, going to the ministry, going to foreign embassies, trying to get what the latest stories are, going out to meet people. This is also something I think researchers could learn a lot from. Actually, this particular aspect of journalism, going out, taking meetings, being on your feet. I think people tend to think of research as a desk job, sort of sit with your books and sort of think about the world, but actually it's a lot of going out and just meeting people and getting new perspectives. So I think the speed, also the range of subjects that you have to cover. At ORF, I used to cover China, I used to cover East Asia, I used to cover Japan, Korea, Taiwan. But here, I can write about the Middle East one day. Yesterday or a day or two ago, I'm sure people would have noticed that the president of Guyana, the president of Suriname, both of them were in town. I was chasing those stories. So I think that it's really just a massive diversity in terms of the stories you're asked to cover. And I think it's good. It gives you a very good sense of what the country is up to generally. And it also gives you a fantastic ringside view in the sense that you have access to foreign ministers, diplomats on a very day to day basis. And I think that's very exciting.
Right. It is because, especially in terms of being a reporter or covering subjects like defense or foreign affairs, a lot of
Mhm.
things are very hush hush in
They are.
countries like India.
Yeah.
So you really need to be one of the best in order to dig good stories and come up with good pieces like that. So how do you counter challenges like that?
I think that a part of it is, and I think any reporter would tell you this, part of it is really being lucky and keeping your ears open. I've of course only been in journalism 4 months, but some of the best stories I've done thus far have been stories where, I've just kept my ears open and someone said something interesting. And I said, oh, wow, that is interesting. Someone will let something slip and then you just have to follow up with it on your own time. And I do think things are hush hush. I do think that unlike certain other establishments in the world where people are a little more open to talk to you, I do think that the Indian foreign policy, national security establishment does tend to be quite tight lipped until they get to know you. But I think once you start writing good stories, you've been in the game for a while, you've built that sort of rapport, things sort of begin to ease. And you do get that access, you do find it easier to make your way. Until then, of course, it's still a struggle. I am still very much in that stage where it's fight to get your foot in the door. But I also think that there's a lot you can do. sort of circling around people rather than having to directly kick open doors. So if you're creative about it, it shouldn't be a problem.
And a lot of the decisions were run by the PMO until recently, as far as foreign affairs is concerned. And I think everybody largely knows this, but very few acknowledge it. But it's the reality over there. But suddenly, with Dr. Jayashankar becoming the foreign minister, now India is the president of G20 this year as well. MEA is equipped with a lot of work to do. So, in that sense, do you see that shift from the PMO slowly coming back to the MEA, or how do you observe this personally?
Right. I think that this is a broader trend. I think foreign ministers, right from the time of prime ministers, right from the time of Jawaharlal Nehru, I think he set the trend, which was that they like to take the external affairs ministry as a particular portfolio of theirs as well. Dr. Manmohan Singh also did it. Jawaharlal Nehru was his own foreign minister for a very long time. And Indira Gandhi, of course, very active on matters on foreign policy. Atal Bihari Vajpayee, same thing. And so I think that the prime minister's office is always going to have a very important role when it comes to foreign policy. I honestly do not know how much that has changed in the current foreign ministry. I do know that, of course, the very fact that a career foreign bureaucrat who served as foreign secretary has been elevated to the position of foreign minister speaks volumes about the relationship between the prime minister and the current external affairs minister. But yes, you're absolutely right. There's a lot on the Ministry of External Affairs' plate. I do think they'll be leading a lot. I think part of the leadership is political. If you look at the G20, for example, Amitabh Kant, who used to head the Niti Aayog, is the head honcho. Harsh Shringla, who used to be the foreign secretary, is the chief coordinator, sort of runs point on policy and so on and so forth. But also, and this is, I think, an encouraging development, lots of participation by the private sector in terms of think tanks, in terms of youth organizations getting involved, in terms of science organizations getting involved. The fact that the ministry has inducted, say, 20 consultants into its G20 secretariat and so on and so forth. So I think that yes, a lot of the day-to-day action is actually heading to the Ministry of External Affairs. It's a very busy year. But yeah, I think that certainly I think that dynamic with the ME and the PMO I think work very closely. But yeah, of course, I think a lot of the day-to-day management will of course be with the MEA this year.
So, just to recap what's happened over the last couple of years, I think it's quite significant in terms of how global affairs happened. First we had the pandemic, and slowly the world is recovering from a pandemic. And then there are tensions between countries like China and Taiwan, and Russia invaded Ukraine as well. So, quite
Correct.
a lot geopolitically speaking, and India,
Mhm.
obviously, due to its increasing presence in this multipolar world, whatever India's stance is becomes very important in that sense.
It does.
So, how do you see that shift from non-alignment that we had earlier to multipolarity, which is probably being spoken about? That's the buzzword, right?
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's a very interesting time to be covering Indian foreign policy because of the fact that lots of people will tell you that alignment now is not a very difficult word for New Delhi. It used to be at one point in time, but now, of course, on security issues and defense, for example, we do align a lot with countries like the United States. We know that defense technology and so on and so forth comes from there. In terms of business trade, we also look very much to foreign markets. If for example, I work for a business newspaper, so I can tell you that some of the slowdown in growth that is expected will happen because a little bit of it will happen because the European economies have been so decimated because of their energy war with the Russians. But the point being that we're closely aligning with the West on certain matters of economic policy and greater economic integration. At the same time, we have very strong relationships with other camps, Russia again on defense technology, on we work with a number of countries on climate change. So I think issue-based alignment, as I think the foreign minister has said at several junctures, that India will basically pursue its interests with multiple different groups of countries that share its own interest. So I think that yes, you're right. That movement from non-alignment to being comfortable with alignment has taken place. But I think, of course, the common trend is that that goal of strategic autonomy, that we have options, that we have the capability and the ability to deal with different countries. We maintain a freedom of action. We maintain great relationships with people across the board, from Iran to Russia to the West. I think that maintains a level of freedom and autonomy of action that I think is has always been a priority for Indian foreign policy. But I think yes, with strategic autonomy, we've become more. But as the countries economic interests have grown, defense interests have grown. We've also realized that you can't go it alone. You need to work with different countries in the world, and I think that as the external affairs minister said, and you pointed this out as well. I think it's a time for the world has changed so much that it's a time for calculated risk taking. I think that things have changed so much in terms of old certainties, in terms of the fact that politics was uh, something like Russia invading Ukraine.
That's actually interesting because although there are no uncertainties in terms of our positioning on certain issues in the world or how we vote in the UN, but are there certainties is the question, right? Because it's quite ambiguous. Like, do we have a definition of what India's formal stance is when it comes to the Russian invasion of Ukraine? I mean, you see statements which are fluctuating diplomatically now and then based on circumstances, which is very smartly placed. But how does this impact other non-Western countries, or even countries that are supportive of Russia, countries that have traditionally looked up to countries like India to be the leader of the non-aligned bloc per se? How does this impact their decision making when there is a strategic ambiguity in our foreign policy as such?
Right. So I think India, to answer your question, I think India's position, I mean, foreign ministry, if you go back and read all the UNSC statements that they've made, is very clear in the sense that it says that, look, we immediately call for dialogue and diplomacy. We're calling for both sides to come back to the negotiating table. Depending on who you read, we have also made certain statements at particular points in time that are urging particular parties to sort of come back to the negotiating table. Of course, don't engage in nuclear use or nuclear provocation in any way. But yes, in terms of a direct condemnation of a particular country, India has not done that, and people will just tell you that that's not India's style. For example, the United States went into Iraq. Parliament condemned the invasion. They used the word ninda, but the government of India, of course, the executive did not. The foreign ministry did not. The Soviets went into Afghanistan in '79. We did not condemn them then. Because I think we generally, our view has always been that, look, we do not believe that condemnation necessarily works as an idea of foreign policy. Our idea has always been quiet, sober diplomacy, working behind the scenes is ultimately India's style. That's what works for us. With that said, India's position has been, of course, on Ukraine that everyone go back to your corners, dialogue and diplomacy, and of course, giving humanitarian aid and making sure that our good offices are available on how the rest of the world sees the conflict and what India has done on that. I think that India has, something that I see very very clearly, and this is actually very funny because I asked the foreign secretary when I Quatra this question, and I think his answer was quite. This is my take on his answer, but yesterday we had, of course, a briefing at the Ministry of External Affairs where we were being told about the Voices of the Global South summit that basically just ended, and something that I noticed, and I asked him this question, which is that a lot of the outcomes from this Voices of the Global South summit, which brings over 100 countries around the world from the global south to come together and talk about, to give inputs about, what the G20's priorities should be, how the war in Ukraine has affected them, rising prices, this energy war, food uncertainty, energy insecurity, climate change. So they're really inputting into India's foreign policy. And a lot of the outcomes from that, they decided to set up a scholarship, they did a Center for Science and Technology Excellence. What I was asking was, look, the non-aligned movement already does something like this. Why are we doing something like Voices of the Global South? And the foreign secretary gave a very diplomatic answer, but the sense I was getting, and this is again personally my view, is that this is India's show. That the Voices of the Global South is completely India's show. We don't share the stage with, non-aligned movement was we shared the stage with Nasser from Egypt and Sukarno from Indonesia and so on and so forth. None of that with Voices of the Global South. We run the game. It's India's table, right? And India is the convener. India brings these countries together. It's very much India positioning and channeling itself as, okay, if the West has certain problems with our particular position on Ukraine, we're going to assemble a coalition of countries that's actually over 100 countries in the world and say, hey, listen, we're not alone. And it's very smart strategically to position yourself in that way, that we are the conveners of the global south. And it's really a sign of India's growing prominence that we don't feel the need to share the stage with anyone else. We lead it, we run it, we convene it, and we are therefore positioning ourselves as this sort of like spokesperson for the global south. And it allows us to, because the West likes to wrap itself in this cloak of morality, right? That, oh, we're doing the right thing from a moral perspective. India can come right back and throw that card and say, we've just come from the Voice of the Global South, where there are 100 countries from the global south that have told us that they see the world the way we do. So it's a very smart positioning diplomatically, but this is just one example that I thought would explain how the non-West sees the war in Ukraine and geopolitical developments, and how India is positioned itself in a way that allows it to take advantage of that. So it's a very interesting development.
It is, and in terms of India increasing its, say, influence or foothold in multilateral organizations like the United Nations, which I think has been discussed, is being discussed for decades now. Beyond what you just said, what can India do to increase its strength in a lot of these multilateral institutions? Because reforms are being spoken about, but we see none. But China, instead of creating new international, which they are to some extent, they are creating new multilateral organizations. But they've also captured certain integral parts of, say, the United Nations or something like that. So, what options does India have? Is my next question.
No, I think it's a very good. You mentioned China, and I'll actually say that take a leaf out of China's playbook because there are these old stories. If you go back and look at how China really in the 70s and the 80s, people used to say the Chinese used to have a running joke in their diplomatic service, which is how many people do you need to run a Chinese embassy? And they say four because all it needs is four people to play a game of mahjong because that's what they were doing. They were playing mahjong and doing nothing else diplomatically. And now, 40 to 50 years later, they are. We may have our disagreements with them, but they are a diplomatic power. We do have to reckon with them. And what they did essentially was they learned everything from the start. They send people on deputations. They send Chinese foreign ministry diplomats for 2 or 3 years. They spend time in the United Nations. They come back. They help develop multilateral policy. So I think number one, that idea that we send them on deputation, they have an understanding. They have a clear sense of what they're trying to do in multilateral organizations, how they're trying to shape the agenda. China, for example, is very clear. Every I was talking to someone who was working in the Ministry of Communications, and he was telling me how they had to fight an election in ITU, the Telecommunications Union. It's something that International Telecommunications Union, and people don't think about technical standards very much, but China does because if they set technical standards, they're able to position their companies in a very good way. They're able to secure an economic advantage against the West. So that's how China, in some senses, is thinking about its outreach to international organizations. And I think that India will need to do something similar. Of course, we have a very small diplomatic service, same problem. So sparing a diplomat to go really become a specialist in these organizations is one thing. But China gets out there. They're very clear about what their red lines and priorities are. For example, the World Health Organization to this day, you'll have a devil's job of trying to get Taiwan included in, despite the fact that Taiwan was one of the first countries that was sort of saying, hey, listen, something might be happening with this COVID-19 thing. Taiwan was one of the first countries that took notice and had a very successful COVID-19 management model. But no one wanted to hear it because the Chinese have successfully used their foothold in multilateral organizations to keep them out. So China has a clear understanding of what it wants to use, its ends in terms of what it wants to use multilateral organizations for, and then it trains its diplomats and its foreign policy organizations to basically get out there and achieve those things with energy and with some level of determination about what it wants to get done. So I think that that is something that India could learn from, because we talk about reform the UN, do this, do that, but you need a real strategy, you need real
Yeah,
resources.
getting the basics right is something that we've been struggling with, and even in terms of the strength of officers that we have at the MEA, I think it's really low. If I'm not mistaken, even Singapore has like 12,000 strong foreign service officers.
Slightly
I'm not
smaller,
sure
it is
about
around
the numbers, but
yeah,
yeah.
800 around. Yeah. So the thing is that the numbers are a little different, right? Like the Ministry of External Affairs said 8,000 at one point in time, but that was including the ICCR and a bunch of other people. The current number is 2,700, which in itself is funny because it also includes the IFSB diplomats, who are people who serve initially as executive assistants, as day to day running the diplomatic operations of a mission, and then later stand a chance to be promoted to the main foreign service, the IFSA. And that foreign service, the for service that would really be doing something like go to the UN, figure out what our multilateral strategy is around 800 or 900 strong. And this is the real
Precisely,
issue. I mean,
that's my point, right? Like, if
yeah,
your core strength is so limited,
yeah,
then pursuing a lot of the goals that you have in terms of your foreign policy ambitions is severely limited,
it is
purely in
absolutely,
terms of manpower. And especially a
absolutely.
country with a significant standing like India should not be dealing with manpower out of all the problems that we'll have. Since you attend all of these MEA meetings regularly, have you taken this up? And I mean, does the MEA actually have a particular stance on this? What are they working on?
So one thing is that the Ministry of External Affairs, I remember Ambassador Menon, Shivshankar Menon, who used to be the National Security Advisor, Foreign Secretary, once said that the ministry has doubled the intake of new diplomats to the UPSC. So they used to take 9 or 10 diplomats, now they take 25, 30. And he said that you wouldn't know because it really feels like there's been no difference, because our responsibilities have increased so much that you can keep doubling, but like you will at some point need to induct talent. So I think that there is the fact that they've doubled, the fact that they've inducted consultants, they are looking at fixes and solutions. But a foreign secretary I spoke to recently basically said that, look, fundamentally in terms of lateral entry, he does not think anything will change, because the bureaucracy's interest is to keep sort of outsiders out. Because India's, and it's very funny, I was talking to someone about this, that India's diplomatic service is a little strange in some senses, that if you get in, you are guaranteed to retire as an ambassador, which is very strange. No other diplomatic service does this. Ambassadorship's not handed out as like a thank you, you cleared UPSC at 22 years old, you are getting an ambassadorship, congratulations, come back to see us in 30 years, right? This is something that India does and very few other countries do. And I think it is, and this is actually against what the initial idea of the foreign service was. When Nehru first came up with it, he was like, foreign service officers, like the American State Department, should not come in with the expectation of becoming ambassadors. They should be prominent people who've been picked from public life, and that's how he chose to do it. And that's how the Americans, for example, do it. But we don't, and that has severely limited us, because if you have a massive influx of people coming in from the outside, it messes up promotion structures. And so the bureaucracy has a very it has an interest in keeping things current. My sense, though, and again, this is just one of my pet theories, but I think that's something that because the bureaucracy has such a entrenched interest, right? I do still think that there are some things that they can strongly. For example, G20 is one of those things where they have significantly relied on outside parties to get things done, because they can't do it alone. Another thing that I think is interesting is, forgive me using the Chinese example again. The Chinese use their think tanks to great effect, and we can talk about this if we're talking about narratives and why India's narratives don't play as well in the world. But I think that the Chinese have done something's very good, well, and this is something that the Koreans, actually, I was in Korea a while back, they do extremely well, which is that think tanks provide a lot of the intellectual firepower that comes to the Ministry of External Affairs, to their foreign ministries. In India, the think tanks are not even the B team of the ministry; they are the C team. If they're sometimes thought of to come in and do things, they're like, let's do one track 1.5, one track 2 dialogue. But that's about it, right? We're not using our think tanks well. We're not investing in talent. In China, if you want to get to know what the ministry is thinking, you go to the Chinese Academy of Arts and Sciences, you go to the Chinese Academy of International Affairs, you talk to people, because those experts are connected. They
We
go
have
out
some
and
really
represent.
think tanks. It's not that we've not built think tanks. I think that's
Yeah,
one
yeah.
of our proudest achievements in the last 10 years or so.
Yeah. No, I think that those have increased, but I do think that that change is coming in. But in terms of as a providing intellectual firepower, that an Africa expert sitting in a particular think tank is directly connected to the JS, is actively thinking about what the policy should be. I think that those linkages need to be strengthened a lot more. And again, like I said, in terms of narrative work, this is something we can talk about in a little bit. But that's something that I think tanks will be mobilized to do a lot more, and they are not. So
But
those are some
yeah,
changes that I think.
even in terms of the narrative war that we are speaking about, we cannot adopt similar steps that probably the United States has done in Iraq or Afghanistan. Because if you go deeper into it, you wouldn't find much of a difference between how China is trying to build narratives with certain institutions like Confucius Institutes. And even in terms of all the psychops that America did in Afghanistan, if you were to go into the details of it, I think people would be disgusted and equally surprised at the abilities that they have. In terms of institutions, like this is something I was also very passionate about. I'm passionate about. I think the United States had from time to time reformed a lot of its institutions that can build narratives. I think when around the time of World War II, they had a different institution. They had Office of War Information, I think, during World War One, and then they had USIA. Now again, it's come back to the State Department. But the point is that they've been reforming their institutions from time to time, depending on what their needs are. Like post 9/11 as well, I think it's completely changed, and post Afghanistan, it's changed once again. In India, do you find certain spaces for institutionalization of these policies? Has it been there silently at least? Because I know that we have public diplomacy division in the MEA, but I think it's almost inactive since the time it was launched.
I do think that specific bureaucratic policies aside, I do think that in terms of narratives and getting out there, I think that it does not happen as well. Because when you think about narratives, right, it's a bunch of things. It's, of course, the US government does certain things, then think tanks, which are all pals and buddies of the United States government, will, of course, also have Someone once told me that the level of groupthink that takes place in America when it comes to think tanks, that someone fashionable says something and that becomes the establishment view, and you're a leper if you say something that criticizes it. Then think tanks get involved. Then think tank experts go on the media and then they basically say that, hey, listen, they go on CNN and New York Times and so on and so forth. They write op-eds and then they manufacture opinion in a particular way that have. So it's a very formidable machine, right? And then there are, of course, organizations like Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, things like that of course had a particular role. Radio Free Europe, of course, in the World War II served a reasonable role, of course, now. So but you see, there's a massive public communications infrastructure that exists, and you have to look at it and see that, okay, what do we have, for example. And if I were to look at media channels, I think that what India says is seen, I think, reasonably well seen in the neighborhood. It's seen in India, definitely. It's seen in the neighborhood. I think that some channels, for example, like Vion, are trying to reach to a more international audience. They are, I think, getting to some places like the Middle East, like Southeast Asia, and so on and so forth. But I would also see that, for example, from my personal recollections and from what I have seen, for example, when the foreign minister, I was sitting down with a diplomat, with a Japanese diplomat, and for example, we were talking about the war in Ukraine, and he said, "Look, as professional diplomats, we understand your position, but our politicians don't understand because they see things a particular way. Japan, in some senses, is a member of the global West, which is a very good friend of ours, and our public definitely doesn't understand. So I think that yes, we are calling upon some of our traditional strengths in the global South, in the developing world, and so on and so forth. But have we developed the kind of public infrastructure that allows us, the kind of infrastructure, whether governmental or private sector, that allows us to really get out there? And whether it's government, you mentioned, of course, the public diplomacy division, whether it's think tanks, whether they used, and whether we've built a core of experts that can go toe to toe with the best of the best in the West and really, shine. Where are our superstars? Where are our foreign policy superstars? Whether they're journalists or experts, and then media organizations as well. So I think Vion, of course, a little bit is trying to. That's just one example. But for example, I can tell you as a journalist that I'm often told that, oh, foreign affairs is the beat that people care least about, which is completely untrue. But
Yeah,
we're often told that Indians don't care about foreign affairs, or it's like a sideshow and things like that.
yeah.
So that infrastructure that we're talking about, we talk about
That's
narratives.
changed. Yeah,
It's changing, but it needs to change much faster. It needs a concerted
right.
effort, and everyone needs to sit together, whether it's media, think tanks, government, to really be like, okay, how do we sell the India story better? And I think that that's something that needs to happen.
Yeah, even in terms of how foreign policy matters are integral to a lot of electoral importance. I think it's only after Balakot strikes is when how we deal with China and Pakistan became very important to the common public as well. Like they do care about how we deal with these things, and it's not just about patriotism and a lot of these things, right? So it's about that national standing and power positioning as well. So yeah, I think you're right. And you mentioned Japan, and we have a lot of allies in, say, Japan and South Korea, and a lot of Southeast Asian nations which have the same trouble as facing aggression from China. So how do we further relations with them by also keeping in mind the delicate balances that we'll have to do in terms of also getting along with China in a certain way?
Right. I think that India has done a lot of very good work in the last couple of years, especially in the last decade, in reaching out to these parts of the world. I think that part of this is because we've had, you mentioned, the delicate balance with China. I think India's risk tolerance has improved a great deal. In fact, I can give you an example of this. Like 10 years ago, Defense Minister A.K. Antony was telling people, when the Congress government is leaving, he was telling his defense services that, listen, let's not do too many exercises with the US. It's annoying the Chinese. And recently we did Yuddha Vyas, which was literally on the LSE on the mountains with the United States. It doesn't take a genius to put two and two together and see who it's aimed against. And that's a change that's happened in 8 years, right? In terms of how India sees risk tolerance, right? And therefore we've been much more comfortable going out there and saying, look, we're going to build relationships. So we're working with we're selling BrahMos missiles to the Philippines. We're giving defense lines of credit to Bangladesh. We're giving defense lines of credit to Vietnam. We're helping build maritime capacity in Vietnam. We have built strategic dialogues with the Koreans, of course we have the Quad. We have building the Air Force right now is exercising with Japan, which is one of the last remaining frontiers really in terms of India-Japan military cooperation, and that will continue, I think, to improve. So on the defense and the political side, which is that if you look at maritime cooperation, it's improved. But you hear a lot about white shipping agreements, about maritime fusion, about domain awareness. So in the maritime field, we've really expanded our ability to work with countries in the region. political ties. The prime minister, of course, and the foreign minister very much enjoy visiting the region. They get out there. I think it's very important. But our 2+2 dialogues, the levels of political coordination we have, that's also changed a great deal. Capacity building, we're helping the military get out there. We've also built closer ties with the United States by signing key foundational agreements. So that's the politics and the defense side. It's the navy side. I also want to say something that we could do much better, which is the economic side, which is there was something we do not do. I was sitting down with someone on the there's an old saying in international relations, right, which is that the flag follows trade, and what that essentially means is that where there is trade, where we have an economic interest, there the interest of the country will be. And the best example of this, for example, if I could just for listeners generally talk about how important this is Taiwan. Look at this; it's a country of 23 million people, and what does it have? I mean, it has these crucial strategic semiconductors, which means the rest of the world has to pay attention to it. I mean, the it commands so much global attention because everyone understands that global industries. I mean, because of tensions in a particular part of the world, we understand that our automotive industry, India's growth plans, India's growth story depends on, in some part on how Taiwan resists Chinese aggression and the threat of a Chinese invasion. So it's a very simple way of saying that a country's economic power and economic strength will create investment in India. And I think that there are some parts of the region where we do need to, I think, step up our economic game. I think ASEAN, of course, the economic relationship has deepened, but I've spoken to lots of ASEAN diplomats, and they're like, look, India is distinctly not on the same tier as a US or a China when it comes to its economic presence in ASEAN. Same thing is true of Japan and South Korea. I was sitting with someone from a Japanese trade delegation recently, and he's like, we just don't know what India can sell to us, right? Because we've really tried looking at, okay, how can we improve the fiscal deficit between, say, the trade deficit between both countries. We just don't really have anything that we can buy from India that will break into the Japanese market. I was in Seoul talking to someone in the Indian embassy, and I was saying, what do you want to sell to Korea? And he was like, we're looking at some things like grapes and stuff. The grapes are fine. Like I look down on legitimate business, but that's what $50 $100 million. That's not like $100 billion trade relation. I mean, if you look at the trade numbers from China, we're trying to diversify, and our trade with them has shot up, well north of $100 billion. That's the kind of volume we need to be thinking about. So I think our interest with these and our partnership with these relations and with these countries will deepen beyond the politics and defense side if we also invest in the economics. And that, I think, is someplace where we're a little underweight on. And look, I think part of this might, of course, improve. I mean, because Morgan Stanley predicts what the doubling of the economy in the next 10 years. So, of course, you're going to see much closer relationships. But we need to also focus on, how do we build those economic relationships? Because that's what a complete relationship looks like: economics, politics, defense, maritime cooperation, all of those things. That is how you create lasting relationships, because it's just a complete relationship that I think we're a little underweight on the economics, but we should definitely go out and build that. Yeah.
We've covered more or less what elements India needs to be careful about, but even with increasing economic strength, you've not been able to fulfill a lot of the ambitions that we had, say, in terms of what we wanted for Act East policy, like the infrastructure projects in Southeast Asia that we wanted to build, trilateral highways, and a lot of these things have stalled over the years. Is it purely because of logistical or some of the reasons that we've not been able to carry out, or is there some other kind of roadblock that's stopping us from pursuing a lot of these things?
Yeah, this is difficult. I think, again, not an expert on infrastructure, but you're absolutely right. It is true that India is not necessarily seen as a major deliverer when it comes to infrastructure building in that part of the world. I think that we have, for example, worked on development, we have worked on digitalization, and so on and so forth. So they say the soft addition to hard infrastructure. But yes, it's true that India has not really been seen in a big way contributing to infrastructure investment in the way that for example, Japan and China are seen as the clash of the titans in Southeast Asia when it comes to that sort of infrastructure investment. India has, of course, not been seen as a player on the same scale. As to the reasons, I couldn't speculate again because I'm not an expert on this. But if I may say something, I do think that there are conversations about improving that. For example, that beyond the slate of things that we're already doing, whether it's with Myanmar, whether it's with regional connectivity generally. For example, I wrote a story about this that Japan is now sitting down with India and Bangladesh and is going to consider linking all the disparate infrastructure projects that we have in this part of the in towards the east of our neighborhood, and basically seeing whether we can attract Japanese investment that's moving out of Southeast Asia because of rising wages and bring them to the northeast and to Bangladesh. Now, whether that will work is a different matter, but that's a strategic big thing in terms of we're going to connect the infrastructure that we're building. We're going to try to attract investment. And once we do that, they, for example, built Matabari ports. They're building ports. They're building roads. Japan is talking to Bangladesh on a trade agreement. We're, of course, also talking to Bangladesh on a trade agreement. So we're looking to see how well we can improve the policy tools. So there's really a strategic big thing in terms of saying we are going to make a active effort to reach out to that part of the world and go down there. But yes, so I think that there is an improvement in India's strategic big think in these parts of the world. But yes, you're right. In terms of heavy infrastructure, I do think India has some significant projects, but is it seen on the same level as a Japan or a China? It is not. That is an inescapable fact. Yeah.
A couple of questions before we wrap up, Shashank, and these are related to China and the ongoing conflict in Russia and Ukraine. One of the questions is that what long-term effects will the Russia-Ukraine war have on India-Russia ties? And part B of that is, as we become more independent, will we move away from Russia or build deeper ties?
I honestly think that if you're asking me my gut feel, I think that we will move slightly away from Russia. And I think the reason for that is there is I think we want to maintain Russia as a key ally. They have been a very strong friend over the years, and I don't think it gives anyone any pleasure to see what's been happening. But the problem is that so as someone wrote recently in an article, the fundamental problem is that Russia's interest is now in a stronger China and a weaker West and a weaker United States. As much as we clash and bicker with the West, our interest is in a stronger West because, like I said, right, we're expected to see a slight growth slowdown. Next year would be great, but of course, we're also expected to see a growth slowdown because if Western export, West is having a recession, for example. So if that happens, our economic growth is affected. So we need a stronger West, and we want a tame China. And so our strategic interests are pulling us, at least over the foreseeable future, in slightly different directions. Also, I think, and this is something that purely I have picked up in my conversations with diplomats and just my sense of the street in terms of what's happening. I think there is, even though India does not say it, there is a sense that, look, no one is happy about the fact that Russia has gone into Ukraine. It is seen as a strategic mistake. It is, and again, purely what I have been hearing on like the whispers in the corridors is that India very well understands that it is seen as a strategic mistake. I think there is a level of okay when Bucha happened, especially, and the fact that people were like, okay, that was actually the closest India came to ever saying a direct condemnation of Russia, where it said, no, we want an full independent investigation into this, which meant that it was giving allegations certain credence that human rights violations had been conducted. So I do think that there is also a broader sense that one, there is a strategic pull aside. There is also the sense that Russia has made a mistake that I at least pick up in the Ministry of External Affairs, and I think because of that, you are going to see certain divergences over a period of time. But of course, they're just huge divergences. I think we want to maintain part of the tragedy for us also, Sharan, is that we want to maintain one of the reasons why we aren't so rara about the Western position on Ukraine is that we want to keep Russia as a player in this orbit because we understand that if Russia moves into the Chinese orbit, it's a problem for us. I always put it this way, which is that I asked this question to a former Indian ambassador to the United States. I said, look, if we are in a situation where tomorrow there's a border conflict and Russia is essentially in the Chinese camp, and we need a replenishment of our defense supplies, we're going to be putting Russia in a very difficult position where Russia is like, oh, sure, we're essentially now very, very, very close to the Chinese. Our economic growth depends on them, but we also have a very good relationship with India. What would we do? And that's not the strategic position you want to put yourself in, because there's an element of risk, and then you're going to second guess where Russia is going to go on that. But essentially, the point being that they're massive defense equities. There's a massive defense relationship there. We have a very important diplomatic relationship with them as well. I don't think anyone is happy about the way it's going, but I do think that you will see. I don't know if it'll be a complete break, but I do think that there will be some effort to diversify.
Right.
And we'll
That
also
was my follow-up. I basically wanted to ask you that the trust factor is always with Russia, right? Traditionally. But even that's moving away for the reasons that you just stated. And we are far too dependent on defense services from Russia. And maybe slowly we are changing with that, but I think that's going to take a lot of time. Last question obviously has to be on China. What is the outlook for relations with China going forward? What will it look like in, say, 5, 10, 15-year point from now, given that the border tensions and economic rivalry is slowly and steadily increasing year by year?
right. I do think that they're not. I don't think the relations are going to. Someone once said to me very memorably that China has lost a generation of Indians. I think it's broadly true. I think that something that Galwan did, and I think we don't appreciate this enough, is that it was, forgive me for using a Western phrase, is a come to Jesus moment, which was that everyone really woke up and said, okay, these guys, we have, we did the Mamallapuram summit, we extended the hand of friendship to the Chinese, and it was slapped away in a very, very, very public fashion. And I think generally across the board now there is public support for saying that China is a strategic threat, and we will deal with them accordingly. The government has been much more, of course, measured in stone. But if you look across the public, I think that sentiment is widely shared. China has lost a generation of Indians. So I don't think that at the public level, or even at the official level, that the relationship is going to improve at any particular point in time in the future. Especially because the government's also said that unless the border situation improves, that India and China, we're not going to go back to business as usual. As to where things will go, I will rely on not on my own wisdom, but on the wisdom of someone I respect a great deal, Ambassador Vijay Gokhale, who was India's ambassador to China, also India's foreign secretary. I interviewed him and asked him exactly this question. And his sense of this was that, look, essentially what we're going to be doing is that we are in a state of armed coexistence. There is going to be an active LSE over the next 10 years. We are going to see a desire to move away from closer economic dependencies on China. Part of the reason behind the PLI scheme is to cut our dependencies on the Chinese. I think we're going to continue seeing that. Also because I think that fundamentally, China has of course tried to make conciliatory moves towards the West, not necessarily towards us very much. But yeah, again, like China's interests are in a weaker, more tame West, and they have a particular view of themselves, and they have a particular disregard of India's position as a great power, which I think is also fundamentally what is driving this. Is an amazing paper that Ambassador Gokhale has written about how China simply has never regarded India as a great power, and that causes a lot of the disagreement and the problems with between India and China. Whether that can change is China's growth is definitely slowing. There are major economic crises that it is dealing with, whereas India's growth story looks quite rosy. So over the next decade, if that Morgan Stanley prediction that predicted a doubling of the Indian economy over the next 10 years comes true, and China's economy continues to slow, it has major social disparities, whether that's the difference between urban and rural divides, whether it's providing healthcare adequately to people as we're seeing in the COVID-19 pandemic. So if growth stalls and India plays catch up much, much more strongly, China may have to come to terms with the fact that, okay, India is a great power. It is an appellation we were unwilling to give them before, but it, by facts and by, the simple fact that their economy has grown, they're now the third largest economy. If we become that, their military is certainly a lot stronger, and we have to, then China's threat perception of India will, of course, also improve, and then they may say that, okay, an accommodation might be in order, or we might again seek to reset the strategic relationship in some way or the other. I don't see that happening in the foreseeable future. But again, so someone said at the 20s, this is going to be the turbulent 20s. But I do think that at some point in time, if India's economy does grow, if our military capabilities do rise, I think the Chinese will have the facts forced on them, and they will have to basically say, okay, can we reach some sort of strategic accommodation with India?
But it's a little strange in that sense because China has grown substantially in the last 2 decades. But even if you refer to many white papers from the US, they never acknowledge them as a direct threat. They say that they're a near peer competitor. So it's funny in foreign affairs that you never directly acknowledge how strong your opponent is. So in that sense, do you think our own reading, even in the absence of a national security strategy and things like that, how well aware are we as an establishment about the Chinese, about our strategic goals and ambitions, threats, and things like that, which are very crucial to our own survival?
I think there's a very good understanding of the threats. I think that we do have a sense of this. But if I may actually say this, this is one of my pet points in life, which is India in search of ideology. I really think this is an extremely important thing, and perhaps this is a good thing to close on, which is that all great powers or powers that have come to rise in the world, in the history of the world, they have a couple of very important things. India has a couple of those ingredients. Rising economic power. An aspirational youth, people who really believe that they can get out and go toe to toe with the best and succeed. And I think that India has that military revolution, the fact that India's military capabilities are increasing a great deal. So we've got an energy, we've got an enthusiasm, we've got the economic side, we've got the military side. What we need to focus on now is really the ideological side, which is giving people a sense of what India is really trying to achieve in the world. And this, I think, comes back to a sense of threats, understanding of it's all well and good if Dr. Jayashankar understands, and he's a very good public communicator. But at every single level, people need to have a sense of what is India trying to achieve in the world, right? For example, when the Americans were rising in the 1880s, they had this very racist, of course, notion, and that they were up there to uplift and Christianize the world, spread American values like democracy, and free trade. So that was a moral component. They were also a growing economy in the way that India is, and they said that, look, we also need foreign markets, we need to expand. So they combined a moral case with with a practical case, and they went out to the all Americans. And even today, you go to an American and you say, what does America stand for in the world? They're like, oh, we want to spread human rights, democracy, things like that. So at a very deep level, right, regardless how they may have, not lived up to their own standard, every American has some sense of this is what America stands for in the world. It used to be much stronger in the 50s and 60s before Vietnam, but that sense of this is what we are in the world. And I think that in India, we need to do a lot more work on that, which is really come up with a comprehensive ideology that goes to Indians and says, this is what we're about, this is what we stand for in the world. And if you are able to do that, then you will see a much stronger India, which combines economics, military, and ideology. That in a very comprehensive way says that this is what India stands for in the world. This is how our economics and our military combine, and this is how we're going to use it to combat national security threats, this and that. So I think that it gives ideology gives is underrated, and it gives like an overall cohesion to foreign policy, and it creates what we might call a grand strategy. So that's my sense.
Thank you so much, Shashank, for joining us. It's very refreshing to speak to somebody young like you, and it's quite a change from the conversations that I've had. So I really hope we can have such conversations in the future as well.
Perfect. I look forward to it as well, Sharan. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us, and viewers, please do let us know what you thought about this conversation in the comment section below. And if you have any questions for Shashank, we'll put his social media links, and you can ping him directly.